It's a teen talk skating podcast where I embarrass myself. Hello, and welcome to episode number 59 of the Teen Talk Skating podcast. We are getting up in the number of episodes, I will say that. My name is Van Gogh. I hope you all are doing very, very well. I would like to start this episode by giving a shout out to a friend in real life, and I asked her if she wanted to be in the shout out, and she said yes. So, shout out to Vanessa. So I was sitting in history class on Tuesday. We were done with our work, so I was just talking with my friends, and all of a sudden, Vanessa and this other girl that we were both friends with, they clip on a microphone onto my shirt, and I'm being recorded, and I'm it's a flash interview about my podcast, and apparently Vanessa found my podcast, and that's what happens. But shout out to Vanessa for finding my podcast and being a very nice person and flash interviewing me in the middle of history class. Great job, Vanessa. Anyway, ha ha ha. That's literally what I wrote in my notes. Anyway, I hope you all are doing very, very well. I hope you all are not dying of everything. I feel like this week was the longest week of my life. I don't know how to explain it, but it really, really was. I felt like I was just in school for hours and hours and hours, which it is. That's like how many hours a day do I spend in that institution we call public education? Like seven? Seven times five? That's 35 hours of my life every single week I spend and do it to school, and then I gotta go home and do homework. Yeah, but I hope you guys are liking your school or work or stuff. I clearly am not. But yeah, I guess we should get to our program of the week before I start ranting about the state of, the education system and why I hate it. But, whatever. Program of the week. Let's go. You're gonna hear some good old music. Program of the week. So, for our program of the week, I decided to pick a program that I think is very fitting to the upcoming Worlds that are happening, obviously, in Boston. So, we're returning to Boston in 2016. We had the World Figure Skating Championship in Boston, and now 9 years later in 2025, we are having that again. So, I thought it'd be fun for our program of the week to go back to a very iconic program from these Boston Worlds in 2016. And that program is Adam Rippon and his 2016 Worlds Free Skate, which is set to, I believe, four different songs from the Beatles. It's the Beatles medley free skate theme. And I chose this program because I feel like it's really iconic and it shows off like this is how you put on a show in figure skating. I think Adam Rippon was always that very big showman, focused on the performance, focused on how the audience was reacting to the program. And I do think that really shines through here. I think it really does start off a little dramatic in this program. Lots of build up going to that first quadlet attempt, a little under maybe, but he gets it done. The crowd goes wild. And then obviously crossovers into that triple axel double toe combo as well. And then as we start kind of building up the music, building up the pace, building up the speed, we get what I have to say is probably like one of my favorite step sequences from Adam Rippon because it is just full of kind of pizzazz and sass and like diva energy, if that makes sense. He is just turning and turning, and he like points at the audience, points at himself, big smile on his face. He's clearly enjoying his step sequence. And then we go into kind of like these moments where he's pausing and kind of posing for a second, a split second, until he starts getting again more turns and just more intricacies. It really shows that yeah, you can be technical with the steps and how complicated they are with the rockers and choctaws and the whatnot, the brackets and whatnot. But you can also be such a big showman with these big expressive hand motions and facial expressions. It really does add to the performance so much more on top of that technical layer. And I'm happy that they gave him great components as well. Going through the program, even better with a lot of the other jumps. He does his iconic rip on triple lutz, two arms above the head. Beautiful to watch. In the second half of the program, near the end, he kind of does a spread eagle into another triple lutz, rip on lutz, double toe, double loop, I believe. And then he is beautiful, beautiful layback spin as well because he's super flexible. And then kind of like the very last closing seconds of the program, split jump into some other things, kind of like turns, I guess, and then he kind of turns and turns and turns, and then into the very last triple salchow, which is amazing to watch. and then that very last spin, you can feel the energy of the crowd like going, 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 and like you just know this is gonna blow the roof off of the dang arena, and I think it definitely does for sure. And even at the end, he's like, "Yeah, like I just did that," and he puts his fist in the air, and he's like, he like you can hear like the scream of victory almost, and then he even puts his hand to his ear to be like, "What's that? What is that I hear? Is that applause for me?" And I love that. Like I don't know, he's just a great performer. I think Adam Rippon was always up to give a great show, and I do think that is why this program is so iconic for me. So go check it out after you watch this episode. Adam Rippon, his 2016 Worlds Free Skate at the Boston Worlds. And yeah, we're going to return to Boston in 2 weeks. Will be very exciting. But now it is time for your main episode. Dun dun dun. That was really bad. That was your program of the week. Okay, so this is another video essay episode, which is always a fan favorite. You guys always seem to enjoy when I make these video essay episodes and kind of analyze the sport of figure skating from the outside, from the inside, from all the sides, from the media perspective, from the fan perspective, from the skater perspective, things like that. And I'm really happy, obviously, that you guys enjoy these programs, these video essay kind of themed episodes, because it is kind of the content I really enjoy making. I love to review competitions as well, but obviously I am really invested into kind of like the not the drama behind figure skating, but kind of what is causing all the drama in figure skating, because figure skating is often a very dramatic sport. And this topic has been on my mind for quite a while, but it's kind of been brewing in the back of my head in a big giant cauldron of thoughts and schoolwork and stress. I've been trying to figure out exactly what I want to discuss, and so in this episode, I really want to discuss the idea of toxic masculinity and how it affects figure skating as a sport, which I think will be a very interesting topic. I think it is does relate a lot to what I've done about social media and about the idea of pressure that we did a couple weeks back. So obviously, go check out this episode as well if you're interested in this kind of thing. If you're interested in more of the competition content, that will come up very very soon. You can always go back to watch the old ones as well. But today we're going to do a video essay episode about toxic masculinity, which, to start off in general, is of course a huge topic that has to do with, giant societal constructs and gender roles and the patriarchy and norms and history, and like how the patriarchy has kind of been implemented in society over time and things like that. And obviously, it is all very very interesting to me. It's a topic I'm very interested in. I'm very much that like social issues, like nerd kind of thing. But that this isn't the place for that. So I want to specifically talk about the idea of toxic masculinity with figure skating today. Um, but just it is very broad. It can be applied kind of pretty much anywhere in terms of society and things like that. It could be with other sports, could be other things in life. I don't really know, but obviously, I am only a bit of an expert in figure skating, not really an expert. But I don't want to like spread my expertise like outside. You know what I mean? But like anyway, today we're gonna cover the following topics in this episode, which is what is it, like what is toxic masculinity in relation to figure skating, where does it come from, so where it originates from, like the type of people who create it, the type of sources that create it, media maybe, the effects of it, which is really the big emphasis of all my video essay episodes, is how these things affect skating, skaters, the audience, etc. And then the last part is always kind of like how to combat this kind of hate or negativity, or go against this like negative thinking or negative perspective that we often see in real life, online, etc. How can we combat against that? And then yeah, so to start off with the idea of toxic masculinity and skating, I want to talk about what is it, right? It's important to have this like definite definition, this definite idea of what toxic masculinity is. And it is kind of, it is broad. It isn't like very like pinpoint this thing. It's not an object, it's more of an overarching idea. And so the definition I've come up with is that toxic masculinity in figure skating is a culture of seeing figure skating as an inherently feminine sport, and therefore a inherently not masculine sport, and therefore it is not meant for men. And so with that idea is kind of like, I'm gonna go into this a lot in this episode, is that kind of associating figure skating always with being a girl, being feminine, being girly, being not very manly or tough or masculine or brutal in that kind of stereotypical way that we often see. And so while that's the definition, I do see it kind of manifesting itself in kind of bashing on men who partake in figure skating, or not even men. A lot of these people are sometimes just young boys, teenage boys who are in skating, not just like adult men, bashing on uh, people who watch figure skating that are guys that are not women and saying like this is not, a girl, this is a girl sport, like why is this guy watching it? That's me all the time. And then just bashing on the sport in general, I would say, not even on specifically the people who watch it or the people who in it, or just the sport in general, saying it's not a sport, I feel like is a lot of times what people say. I have an episode about that, about why figure skating is a sport, because oftentimes it is seen as not a sport because it's not tough enough. It's not there, it's not tough enough. I don't see people falling on and bleeding. I don't see people, bashing into one another, things like that. Obviously, with the idea of injuries and eating disorders and mental health disorders and all these issues that we have in figure skating, it is not, and seeing that as not tough enough is obviously ridiculous. But to go further with that, so overall, toxic masculinity and figure skating is this overall like general deep misunderstanding of the sport, and that leads to this negative perspective. I want to point out the word misunderstanding because a lot of times this toxic masculinity does not come from people who are very educated about the sport of figure skating, or like know really well what figure skating is really like and like how the system works and how jumps work and spins and step sequences and whatnot. A lot of time it does come from people who have a very surface level understanding of figure skating. And that surface level understanding develops into a deep misunderstanding about the sport, that leads to this overall negative perspective that we see. Now, I will note kind of as like a footnote that it is, I will say that this idea of figure skating as a very feminine sport about the toxic masculinity, you really only see it in in some countries. Today I'm obviously going to be focusing on the US because that's where I live. That's where I feel like I interact with the most figure skating fans. Like a lot of figure skating fans come from the US in general. The ones I see online, a lot of them come from the US. Obviously, there are plenty of people in the world that watch figure skating, but the ones that I at least interact with online, I feel like are from the US. Like a good amount of them, if that makes sense. But obviously, this is definitely occur in other places, countries in Europe and in Asia, and in everywhere in South America and Africa and Oceania. Everywhere is kind of this. This manifests itself everywhere. But today, I will say I'm only going to be focusing on the US specifically, because that is again where I live and everything. I will say though that, another footnote, another asterisk, if that makes sense. Some countries like Japan, for example, where, there are some countries like that where it is definitely not seen as a girls only sport. There's a very healthy community, very healthy way of looking at figure skating as a sport for both men and women, for men and women together in pairs and ice dance, etc. A very healthy culture looking at figure skating as a very diverse sport for everybody, regardless of your gender. So those countries, they definitely do exist. I'm not trying to say like this overall blanket statement that the whole world thinks that figure skating is a feminine, girly sport that men should not partake in. No, there are definitely some countries like Japan, for example, where it is definitely not seen as a girls only sport, and it is seen as very respectable and very, very great for a guy to be competing in figure skating with, in those countries. So, moving on from what is it, I want to talk about where it comes from. So, I will say that, it's hard for me to pinpoint exactly where figure skating comes from, or this kind of stereotype and this idea of figure skating being feminine being coming from. I will say that it isn't like one thing that changed everything. I will say I think it's more of like it's been ingrained into American society over time. It's definitely not a recent thing at all. It's been happening for, decades, maybe the whole century that figure skating has been a kind of a major sport. But definitely historical progression for sure. And so I will say it is kind of a more historical progression from what we've seen from the media, the press, the fans in general over time, and obviously the haters as well. I feel like it is more of a historical process. And so starting off, like I think the important thing to look at in terms of where does it come from is breaking down figure skating into its most basic components. If that makes sense. I will say I think that figure skating is kind of seen as this more feminine sport because there's an element of art in it, and with the component side and the performance there's this art, right? There's this piece of art in it, that sports like basketball or football don't really have this kind of art to them, that their players don't perform, they don't dance, I guess. And so there is this big stereotype that again is affecting these other things as well, that things that are artsy and creative and kind of dance like, performance like, are more associated with women, with girls, with being feminine and being pretty princess graceful thing, you know what I mean? And so that I think has kind of leaked into figure skating as well, because figure skating is also a very artsy sport and it's a creative sport, and that's what makes it beautiful. But that's what people tend to pick on because they see it as very feminine, and that makes it negative. And obviously that does come with a lot of misogynistic and sexist views as well. That is a whole nother can of worms to open up. And so I do think people tend to associate figure skating with the artsy side, on a more like stereotypical level than the side that is jumps and spins and doing quads and throwing people into the air and lifting people up. That is not associated as much with figure skating, I think, which obviously the two sides of the sport are kind of equal in a sense. Maybe now they're not equal, um, in terms of like the technical side and the artistry side being equal in terms of like how much it matters to your score and things like that. Again, another whole can of worms, but the overall thing I'm trying to get at here is that people usually see, in my opinion, what I usually see is that other people perceive figure skating to be kind of feminine and very graceful because there's this very artsy, creative dance performance element to it. And so people automatically associate that with being kind of feminine, and therefore it's not for boys. It's just not for boys. And so it almost makes it feel unserious to some people because this can be a real sport because it has some art in it. Like that's too easy, right? Like being artistic and creative is easy, which obviously it is not in figure skating because we see a big artist like once in a blue moon, I feel like. But it makes it very unserious because people think art is easy, that dance is easy, performance is easy. It's just moving your body. Like it can't be that hard. And obviously it is very, very hard, but on the surface level, again, it's just not serious, and like people think it's too easy, so it's meant for girls, and it's not meant for guys at all, because guys should do things that are hard and tough and require muscle and require strength, and they shouldn't do things that require precision and accuracy and like gracefulness, right? So, with that whole giant can of worms comes so many stereotypes. One of which I'm gonna say is the pretty princess stereotype, as we kind of refer to it as in this episode. That I'm gonna refer to it as that in this episode. The pretty princess stereotype is that figure skaters wear long dresses and they have nice makeup done, they have their hair down, and they just float around and they skate nice on the ice and they try to look pretty and things like that, which is the kind of pretty princess stereotype, that this is not a tough sport at all. And again, this has been ingrained over time. I won't say that is kind of just a recent thing in the 2020s or the 2010s at all. Media. I do think media obviously control society, or they don't control society, but they influence society a lot. I will say in the past, like I'm saying like the 80s, 90s, I feel like a lot of like figure skating back then was very geared towards the pretty princess stereotype. That makes sense. Like trying to sell popular figure skaters, female figure skaters, especially, as this kind of very graceful. I'm very perfect. I like, feminine things like that. Um, I have seen quite a lot of people kind of comparing. I know this is a whole different situation, but the whole Nancy Kerrigan and Tonya Harding thing, that people often see Nancy Kerrigan as a very graceful princess like figure, and Tonya Harding as a very tough, going for the technical triple axel figure. So the media was definitely kind of selling up. They were kind of hyping up this kind of pretty princess stereotype that kind of they've become better at like not going to these stereotypes for sure and kind of allowing skaters to be themselves. I feel like Amber Glenn is a great example for in recent memory, very recent memory, obviously she's still competing. That Amber Glenn, I feel like they haven't pushed her at all into this very pretty princess stereotype. They're kind of like going off of Amber's like already like just being her, right? Like being allowing skaters to be themselves, like and not putting them into this one size fits all box that we often see from a lot of people who have a very negative view of figure skating is that you're a pretty princess or you're not. That's it. That's what it's my way or the highway. You're a pretty princess or you're not skating at all. Um but obviously, I do think that, or honestly, I do think that the media has gotten better at kind of avoiding these stereotypes and kind of doing or saying things better and writing articles in a better manner. And like the commercials, advertisements are all like, they're more inclusive. They feel less like constrictive and like, hey, you sit here and you do this interview and you act very polite and everything. And so it kind of does reflect kind of the greater freedoms of this time in general, I would say. Um, but yeah, that's kind of where it comes from is that, people have this stereotypical idea of figure skating, and then we have kind of the media influencing that. And obviously, once, one person hears something and they're influenced by the media or by other people, then they're going to spread that to other people. And that's kind of a continuous cycle. Maybe I have no idea what would be an example, but it spreads from person to person. It's not like you can just stop it. It's not like a disease you can get a vaccine for. You can't get a vaccine for, going away from figure skating or something. It just doesn't exist. It won't exist, right? Hopefully. Sus. But I do think that it kind of comes from a combination of just people and society in general and like the media kind of making it up to be a very like girly sport that men are should know men are not in here at all. Um yeah. And so talking about the effects of it, which is really always the main emphasis on my episodes. I'm going to talk about the effects of kind of the sport on the athletes first. I will say it drives guys, especially young boys. Okay, young boys I think are the most important thing to talk about away from the sport. It drives young boys away from the sport in their early, even beginning years of general ice skating, not even starting figure skating, just kind of general ice skating, because figure skaters often share the ice with hockey players, ice hockey players, and so once in a while, I always see Reddit. I'm on Reddit like a lot. Obviously, I feel like that's where I get a lot of figure skating information. Once in a while, I'm on Reddit, and I see that like some type of story or like some type of comment or on the thread or anything about some young boy who was encouraged to join hockey instead. I feel like there's so many stories like that where somebody sees, oh, this boy, he has a ton of potential and a ton of talent. He could be a great figure skater if he kept on advancing his career and everything. But then people say, well, no, figure skating is a girly sport. Figure skating's, not okay for a young lad like you. And so that guy will go join ice hockey instead. And we're talking like young kids. And I don't want to put any shade on ice hockey. Ice hockey is an amazing sport, but this is kind of like the loss of potential in figure skating, I would say. And we're talking this about young boys. These are not adults. These are not teenagers. I'm talking kids around like 5 to like 10, maybe, who are, in their beginning years of just learning how to ice skate. Maybe they're starting to learn a couple of maneuvers here and there about how to better move around on the ice. And so they have potential in figure skating for sure. They could be, the next world champ, maybe if they tried, but people are like, no, you should go into ice hockey. You have the skills for ice hockey. You don't have the skills for figure skating. And I think that kind of the idea of toxic masculinity has to go with that a lot. And why we're seeing in general, there is a lower amount of men in figure skating, at least at the lower levels, at like the junior level, the intermediate level, the juvenile level. I will say that there seems to be less men in those age groups that are young boys, I guess, in those age groups that are going into skating and devoting enough time and training and everything to be really competitive at it. And so it becomes figure skating then, even if you don't like go join hockey, right? Even if you don't join hockey, you still hear maybe like, hey, figure skating's like not a very masculine sport for a man like you, that maybe shouldn't devote as much time to it, right? And it's seen as something very much less serious to devote time to, and other sports are way more prioritized, if that makes sense. Because when you're growing up, if you're like me, when you're growing up, you had a lot of friends who were guys who were going into like summer football camps and basketball and soccer and things like that. And it's compared to that, it's like, why would you go skate? Because like skating is not a very like masculine tough sport. Like, what is that going to teach you? Instead of soccer or basketball or hockey or football or baseball, things like that. And so figure skating becomes kind of this like less serious thing to devote time to. Even if you want to continue skating, people get judged. People are so judgmental about guys in skating sometimes, that it results in a lot of hate, and therefore kind of this negative stigma and environment around the sport that makes it seem a lot less serious. And they're like, why would I spend 5 hours skating when I could spend 5 hours practicing how to throw a ball into a net? Like it is seems like very much less prioritized in that manner. I will say that it makes the sport also even less accessible on top of finances, time, etc., which I do think drives people away from the sport even more. I've talked about it in the past that figure skating is an incredibly expensive sport, both in terms of money and in time. You're not going to learn a triple axel in one day. You might be able to learn how to throw a ball into a net in one day, but you're not going to learn a triple axel in one day. It's like it is a labor intensive, time intensive, money intensive sport that figure skating is. And it makes the sport feel even less accessible because, on top of the $1,000 you're paying for a coach and the 5 hours that you're spending at a rink every week, people like don't like people judge you. Like people don't even give you like praise for skating at all. So it's like, why would you continue skating when it costs so much money, it costs so much time, and people are judging you for doing it? And so it's another added barrier to the sport that makes it less accessible for people who genuinely might want to do it, but other people are saying no, don't do it. And the money it costs, the time it costs, those are already huge issues, and you're adding this whole huge bigger issue of toxic masculinity and this really unhealthy environment for these young boys, again, ages maybe 5 to 10, who are wanting to skate, but the money, the time, and these stereotypical behaviors that people like placed upon them and say like, oh, you should go dance or something, you know what I mean? Like you are like this is too girly for you, things like that make the sport feel again even less accessible, which is really, really, really unfortunate. Kind of a pattern I think a lot of people have pointed out is that in pairs and ice dance, which are partner disciplines, so it is one man and one woman in pairs and ice dance, is that there are way more. Oh, I phrased this wrong in my notes. Sorry. There are way more women in ice dance than there are men, if that makes sense. So like numbers wise, like the numbers, like the numbers. Um like numbers wise, because again less boys in general are joining figure skating, then less boys make it to the level where they are wanting to get an ice dance partner and things like that. Does that do the math right? I'm sorry. So if there's more girls going to the sport, then more girls are going to end up being in the sport than men. And so obviously in pairs and ice dance disciplines where you need a man and a woman together, not every woman is going to be able to get a partner. And that is kind of a result of that, because is that how wait. Yeah, because not every yeah. So not every woman will be able to get a partner because there are less men than women. So more women will pair up with the guys, and there will be some women who are not able to get a partner, if that makes sense. And I think is that how the math works or something? Yeah. 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 Pretend I did the math right. Or it's not even math, it's just kind of like logical thinking. But I will say I have noticed a lot of people saying on Reddit before very unfortunate issues and cases that have occurred is that the men in ice dance and pairs have way too much power. If that makes sense, because there are so few men in pairs and ice dance that they essentially have more power because they are the partner that is not so easily replaced, if that makes sense. Like a lot of people knows how a lot of like pairs men and ice dance men might go through many, 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 many female partners, whereas female partners will only have a few partners that are men. Um, and people have kind of said how that might lead to some of the allegations and cases of abuse or violence that we've seen before, and how the men in pairs and ICANs feel that they have more power, and the figure skating community almost puts them on that pedestal of power themselves. I've seen a few comments like that on Reddit before. And so, obviously that is super unfortunate and kind of, you know, like noteworthy because there is this culture of toxic masculinity around the sport. Less men are entering the sport, and then those men end up in pairs and ice dance where women become their partners, and these men kind of have more power in a sense because they are not so easily replaceable, if that makes sense. And it is this very long dragged out cycle, but ultimately I think it all kind of stems from that root of toxic masculinity leading to less guys in the sport. um, and so that's from the athlete's perspective. From the fan perspective, the audience perspective, I do think the audience perspective drives fans away from the sport because this idea of toxic masculinity, it's causing fair skin to look too feminine, too manly. Not manly. Sorry, it's not manly, or it's not tough enough to be a sport, which I've talked about in another episode. Like I said before, is that figure skating is often seen as not even a sport at all. I've seen it in the YouTube comments before that people are arguing this is not a sport. This is like art, or this is like dance. Like this isn't a sport. Like this can't be that difficult. So kind of belittling again figure skating, and that's causing people to kind of lose their motivation to watch skating or their interest in skating because well other people are judging me for watching skating, so I should stop. And so you might say, like, oh, don't care about what people say, but that is really hard when it's your entire society and your environment kind of pointing out to you that, hey, like, people don't like that you're watching this kind of thing. Which, in my case is, I've definitely experienced that for sure, is that you watch figure skating, like, that's not cool. Like, that's not, what is that? You know what I mean? Because it's like, the question is, why would you watch figure skating when you could watch football, or you could watch basketball, or you could watch baseball? That's like very manly, right? And very, very tough. And figure skating instead is like the bottom of the pack. It's like the garbage can. It's like the meat for the dogs to eat. Whereas, football and baseball and basketball are really put on this podium of like, well, these are the sport that all men should aspire to be in, that all men should draw inspiration from, that all men should la 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 la. And figure skating seems like the opposite of that. Figure skating is the thing people go to when they have no life. It's for losers. And so yeah, it's driving people away from the sport. I feel like it's this like idea of like toxic masculinity. It's driving people away from the sport because people don't want to watch the sport if they're gonna be judged for watching the sport for sure. And so I do think maybe there is this perspective in the sport from a lot of men who are skaters or not skaters, but just audience members or just people who watch figure skating, that overall figure skating is just not for me. It's just not for me because it's a little too girly, feminine, artsy, creative, and I just don't like that kind of thing because other people say that I shouldn't like that kind of thing. Instead of kind of encouraging this idea of just being unique and doing what you want to do, we have this idea of kind of putting people down for doing things that they want to do, which is this. And so that is kind of what's going on with the world, I guess, there. Real quick before we talk about how to combat this kind of idea in figure skating, I want to talk about kind of the effects of toxic masculinity on women as well, because obviously it's important to consider that other perspective when we're looking at issues like this. Is that obviously toxic masculinity is affecting the participation of men in the sport, but how is it affecting the participation of women in the sport? And I would say that toxic masculinity and the idea of figure skating being a very feminine and girly sport and it's very meant for women adds additional pressure onto the women, the female skaters in the sport to kind of go with that, if that makes sense, because patriarchal ideas must be right and the men must be right. Because figure skating is a very girly sport and feminine, so I also have to be very girly and feminine. Again, instead of just letting skaters skate to what they want, skate to whatever music they want, wear whatever outfit they want. They don't gotta be this pretty princess stereotype that the patriarchy has come up with to shame men and to shame men and embarrass men for being in the sport or watching the sport. They don't, the women don't have to be in this pretty princess stereotype as well. And so I feel like we've seen a lot of that in recent years, people kind of going with unorthodox ideas and costumes. Amber Glenn, I'm going to draw on again. Amber Glenn is showing, these programs are like, this is not the pretty princess era that everyone's skating to light and nice violin music. No, it's like skate to what you want because I'm unique and I want to show who I am. And so I feel like the toxic masculinity in the sport kind of affects both the men and the women because the women are kind of pushed into the stereotype of as well of the pretty princess idea. And so overall it's just a negative cycle. And so yeah, I will say that happens as well. And I will say I feel like when people cherry pick evidence, if that makes sense, people kind of ignore the not pretty princess programs and they point out just like one pretty princess program and they're like, oh yeah, this one program defines why figure skating should be seen as this pretty princess sport, and they ignore all these other programs or these other exhibitions or costumes that obviously show that it is not this light, airy princess thing. This is a sport of beauty and a sport of uniqueness, and it's not a one size fits all sport that I think the patriarchy and toxic masculinity often tries to put it into, if that makes sense. Um, and so it really does affect everybody of all age groups. I feel like, especially young kids, I want to put that emphasis on that. Young kids are being affected by this. Young kids are not getting a chance to be who they want to be and do what they want to do. Young kids are very early on being put into this environment that is definitely not healthy for them, where they're being judged and criticized for doing what they love, doing what they want to do. And it is really toxic for that. Um, in terms of having to combat it, the very last segment of this episode, what I've seen from the media, I want to start with the media perspective, the media level. The media right now, I feel like is doing a better job, like I said before, of avoiding kind of the stereotypes that go along with figure skating. They've been including perspective from all skaters. We've seen interviews from all skaters, from retired skaters, from older skaters, from kind of everybody. Figure skating is a sport for everybody, and I do think they're trying to show a better perspective on that. Like, I do know that during Pride Month and Black History Month, they kind of do things related to that. US figure skating tries to do things related to that, and they're trying to show that again, figure skating is really open to everybody. Obviously, figure skating itself already has kind of that equal level of participation in terms of events. So the men and the women have the exact same number of events, unless there's like a shortage at some competition or something. But obviously there is 3 categories where men can earn medals: the men, the pairs, and ice dance, and then 3 as well where women can earn the medals, which is the women's singles, the pairs, and the ice dance. So again, kind of the sport itself is equal, I would say, in terms of like gender equality. In that regard, in terms of like the number of events people can compete in, things like that. Let me know if there is anything else I'm kind of missing that might be not. But both men and women can compete in a good equal amount of events, and so there is no like, oh, women earn more medals and therefore this sport is a women's sport. No, not for no. It is an equal amount of medals, which makes it a very equal sport for people. And so that's that. How do skaters combat it? Skaters themselves, professional skaters, professional athletes, just existing, I feel like maybe is a weird answer. But I love to see skaters. Again, I'm gonna say Amber Glenn because I just love Amber Glenn. I love to see skaters like Amber Glenn who are, very much not going with fitting into that stereotype that people put female figure skaters in, of that pretty princess stereotype. And she kind of just does what she wants. And I love that. I love doing that. I love seeing that. Like, because these stereotypes exist to categorize people and to discriminate against people. And breaking free of those stereotypes and kind of doing whatever the heck you want to do is kind of such a big power move. And I love that. And I love to see kind of that more like just free and loose and not restricted skating, I guess, that isn't so dependent on having to present yourself as the pretty princess stereotype that has dominated the sport for a really long time. So that's what skaters can do themselves, which is just to be themselves. But in terms of like the audience, the fans, like I said for the episode on the state of like pressure in figure skating, it is a very much a matter of like fighting against the negativity. If I heard somebody in school, bashing, dissing, um, putting figure skating on blast, like y'all know what's happening. I'm gonna walk up and be like, "What'd you say? What'd you just say?" Take those words back out of your mouth. But that is kind of the reaction I would have. Is like, what do you mean? If somebody started like putting figure skating on blast, I would genuinely walk up and be like, "Have you seen this? Have you seen Melina? Have you seen la la la?" Like, because people do not know. I think that is the main thing. Is like informing people is a great way to combat figure skating. Do a nice presentation about figure skating for your school. Watch figure skating in front of all your friends, or like, watch figure skating whenever you want. Watch figure skating in the middle of class on your Chromebook. Totally haven't done that. I've done that, but it's like fighting figure skating, or fighting figure skating. No, fighting against that misinformation and like misrepresentation of figure skating. And just like showing people, hey, like, this sport is not what you think it is at all. Obviously, commenting and sharing, what figure skaters like really do for sure. And then if you see any like negative comments, I'm telling you, those like bottom feeder people on Reddit, the very bottom comments that always get downvote those comments that are like, oh, this is a girl's sport. Like, why do we see men doing this? Oh my gosh, this is so atrocious. Awful. And when you hear something, say something back. When you hear something, try to say something, because show people what kind of real figure skating is, instead of this very idealized version they have in their head of the pretty princess and the nice long dress and there's sparkles and there's glitter and there's very nice low spins and they do a little hop. No, 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 no. You gotta show people real skating. You gotta show people the concussions. You gotta show people the fall. You gotta show people the broken ankles and knees. And also show them the big successes as well. I don't know why I went with all the negative stuff, but it's about fighting against misinformation. I do think that is what is dominating figure skating today, is misinformation, and that leads to a lot of restriction in terms of accessibility, for people who want to go skate, as well as people who just want to watch skating, like me, who are just very casual fans that want to watch figure skating. I think that does lead to that big barrier, as I said before, of accessibility. And so we really want to show this real version of skating and not this idealized version of skating. Because honestly, I will say that before watching figure skating, I like really didn't know a lot of the sport. If you asked me in like the sixth grade what I thought about figure skating, like I would have been like, what is that? Like, isn't that like the dance thing on ice or something? Like, don't they do that or something? And then I got into skating and I realized, oh, well, this sport is so much more than I thought it was. I do think that is kind of the reaction people get when they become huge fans of figure skating, is that, wow, this sport is so much more than I thought it was. It's so much more impressive than I thought it was. And that is the best reaction you could have, is that changing your perspective in total. And so I hope you guys can also reflect kind of on your perspective on figure skating and your perspective on how this sport has worked and kind of the societal constructs behind it, such as toxic masculinity. But overall, I will say toxic masculinity is definitely one of the contributing factors driving people away from the sport. Again, whether they want to compete or just watch or be part of it. Hopefully, we can all fight it, as the audience, as the U.S. Figure Skating Federation, as the fans, as the skaters, as the media. Hopefully, we can fight it and show that figure skating is a sport for everybody, regardless of your gender, your sexual orientation, your race, your age, just anything like that. Figure skating is an inclusive sport, and that's why it makes it so beautiful. This is a sport where you can skate to any piece of music that you want. You can do kind of any choreography that you want. You can wear any outfit that you want, and therefore you can be whoever you want to be. And so I think that is kind of where I'm going to end off with that part of the episode. Next week, I will say that we are very much getting down to the wire. I will be going over world's previews for all four disciplines, the men, the women, the pairs, and ice dance, who I think will be in the top 10 probably, and medals and all that kind of thing. And then it will be world itself in 2 weeks, which is absolutely crazy because if you asked me in September, like, world is soon, right? I'm like, no, it isn't. And now just 2 weeks away is the 2025 World Figure Championships in Boston, Massachusetts, where they will decide the Olympic spots, where they will decide everything going on. And for sure, Boston is going to bring some chaos. But I hope you all enjoyed this episode of a Teen Toxic Skating podcast. I hope you enjoyed listening to me rant about toxic masculinity, how it affects figure skating, where it comes from, what it is, and how we can combat it as a community, as skaters, as an audience, as a fan, against toxic masculinity to make sure that the sport is inclusive for everybody, which is, I think, has always been its true heart, even though it's been hidden sometimes. I think the true heart of figure skating is that it's for everybody. It is for everybody. And so next week, catch me on another episode. We are going to head to Boston. Not a super long flight, I would say, from where I live, but we are going to head to Boston and do some previews for the World Figure Skating Championships. My name is Engo. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Talk Skating Podcast, and I will see you next week. Bye bye.